Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is Daniel McAdams, our co-host. Daniel, good to see you.
How are you this morning, Dr. Paul?
Very well. You know, thinking about yesterday's program, it was interesting because we thought the subject wasn't too interesting, but turned out we had a lot of viewers, and the viewers thought it was quite worthwhile. But I remember sometimes I get a little pessimistic, like maybe nobody will watch today or something. And I said, it just didn't look like a big event had occurred. And then about 2 seconds later, somebody calls me up, did you hear? Bolton got fired. Now that would have been big news. It's still big news, and we want to talk about that a little bit. Matter of fact, a lot of times we like the dust to settle a little bit before we, get into those subjects. But we've talked a lot about Bolton. He is probably one of our least favorite persons that we can think of. And he's known as, a super hawk neocon. Mm-hmm. And we always end up with a question, if Trump takes a position where he doesn't want to look like a super hawk neocon, why does he have so many of them there? And so we're not surprised when he finally has to get rid of them. This is his third national security director that he's getting rid of. So the big question now is who's going to replace him? And our title suggests, is it going to be another John Bolton? And so far, it's always been another hawk. Yeah. I mean, he had two generals in there. They were a little bit different in that they weren't political people, but that was almost give Trump some cover because he admires the military and takes their advice. But they were way more hawkish than the image that Trump had during the campaign of it's time to get away from here, time to leave. And that was the opposite. Bolton had no intention of advising that. His main intention, his position, the neocons behind the scenes probably loved him because if Trump got out of hand and actually wanted to talk to some people, then Bolton went into action. So they may be feeling a little frustrated, but it just seems, I don't know how it looks to you, but it just seems like they're going to have influence on the next person. I wished I didn't have to be that cynical, but I'm afraid the image will be a little bit different, but the policies probably won't change.
Unfortunately, I think that's probably true, but I think, I know there are people trying to get in to communicate, to let Trump be Trump, as you've said in the past about let Reagan be Reagan. But it is a real problem, and you got to wonder if a John Bolton replaces John Bolton, then why did John Bolton have to go? We did read that Trump didn't like the mustache, so maybe it's just as simple as that. But, the thing that Bolton was known for is just his freelancing. He did things that he knew that his boss would object to, and he just didn't care. Remember back when the North Korea meeting was going on, and we had they all got together, they were about ready to sign this thing, and then Bolton rushed in there and put out an offer that was completely the opposite of what had been negotiated. You give up everything, and maybe sometime later we'll give you sanctions relief. They said no.
One thing that I thought was interesting is as soon as everybody knows he's out, the media concentrated 99% on, did he quit or was he fired?
Yeah.
Well, the president still doesn't want him, so whatever you call it, that was just sort of, something to talk about. It wasn't, what did he believe in? How much harm has he done? And are we going to get another Bolton? And will there be a change in foreign policy? None of that. It was just, how can we find something and make the president look bad?
Yeah. It was just silly.
They always seem to find something.
Typical. But, I would say, we were pretty happy yesterday that Bolton was gone because he's a symbol of everything that's wrong with the Trump presidency. But I hate to say it, but I think his replacement could be more dangerous than him because Bolton had a real target, painted on him. He was easy to attack. He was easy to talk about. You look at someone like Charlie Kupperman, who President Trump has as acting national security advisor taking over for Bolton. Nobody knows who he is who's not really involved in Washington. But here's Bolton when he named Kupperman his deputy last year. Charlie Kupperman has been an advisor to me for more than 30 years. They're joined at the hip. They're best buddies. So in a way, it would be a coup for the neocons to actually get rid of someone like Bolton, who's sort of a liability. He's a known commodity, and have someone like Kupperman in there, maybe not exactly him if he stays, but if he does stay, someone like him in there who does the same thing, but isn't such a high-profile person. You know, it's actually could be a downside at the end.
You know, we did exist in this country for a very long time without a National Security Council.
Yeah.
And this came out, you know, after World War II, and they said that FDR ran things too much by himself, and that they had to pull in the reins. So they turned it into a huge bureaucracy, you know, and a lot of employees and going along. But you know, I could see where a president, you know, especially in this age with things going on, that you should have somebody that is really good, somebody that the president can trust,
Yeah.
and act like an advisor. And not a publicity stunt person,
Yeah.
not somebody throwing in monkey wrenches to change things. But I don't know how a president would operate under those circumstances, and maybe that's what we're seeing. You can't operate on this when people are trying to outclass the other person in the administration, like Pompeo. You know, there was a conflict there.
Yeah.
But I just think that an individual that wasn't political, and they did it on the quiet, and he would go over all the, I mean, Trump has to get not 100 or 2, there has to be thousands of memos coming through there, and I would think that the advisor going over this would be so much different than this fanfare that goes on here. I mean, Bolton might be the best known national security advisor we've ever had, but fortunately most of it was negative, which probably helped get rid of him.
I would say the most known after Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was extremely, extremely important, unfortunately in a negative way, to Carter's policies. But you know, the national security advisor, which is what Bolton's position was, technically it's called the assistant to the president for national security affairs.
All right.
And that position was created, as were a lot of other bad things, in the 1947 National Security Act. Created the CIA, created the National Security Council, which technically the National Security Council is a group of advisors, including the Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State, Director of Central Intelligence. Now it's the DNI, Director of National. So this is sort of a council that meets. It was originally created in 1947 to confront the Soviet Union and contain the Soviet Union, because the thought was at the time, well, first of all, they had a lot of commies infiltrate the State Department, but they thought that the State Department wasn't sufficiently dedicated to containing the Soviet Union. So this is why it was created in the first place. So it's kind of created to confront, and it has done that. People like Brzezinski, who's made a name for himself for being a confrontational person. So the other thing the National Security Council does, by the way, there's a panel that decides who is on the kill list. And that's secret. So they do have a little bit of work they have to do, and that can include Americans. We know that under Obama, it did include Americans.
Well, it's cumbersome, it's bureaucratic. They're trying to manage things, and literally, you know, we have an empire, so there's lots of things to manage. So in many ways, I think you could make the case for saying that the messiness of the National Security Council and these problems of sorting it out is a reflection of the foreign policy. Yeah. Because as soon as you have an empire, you have national issues to come up with, because we're managing a lot of countries, and then you have a lot of interest in foreign policy. People spending money, and people have special interests, and it gets this way. So you have to have a lot of activity, and I don't know what the budget is, but I bet you the budget is significant, especially if you compared it to having an advisor, you know, to go over these things and give the president some advice. But even that doesn't work. If the president doesn't have an advisor, let's say the president's a non-interventionist, and he gets a key advisor, the guy has to be a non-interventionist. Yeah. So in those circumstances, it would work, and the job would be a lot less, and then people would get hysterical over this. The Republican and Democratic leadership, the congressional people would get a little bit annoyed, because they need this activity to go home and say, I voted for this and I voted for this, I'm protecting this country, I voted for this weapon, and back and forth. So I think the chaos that we see here is just a reflection, once again, of a policy that we don't need. So we don't want another Bolton to replace Bolton.
Yeah.
We want somebody to replace interventionism in our State Department and in our government, in our election, in our presidency, because that to me is the issue, that we change our attitude. And I apply that to economics too. You can't eventually have a sound monetary system unless we replace the Federal Reserve, because it's unworkable. And I think I always hope for the best, but I try to be realistic too. And because the system isn't going to change, I just don't think a lot will come of this.
Yeah, and Tucker Carlson had a pretty good opening monologue last night. I didn't watch all the show, but I read the monologue, and there's a quote from it I think that sort of encapsulates what we try to say, and especially what I really try to focus on. Here's what he said: "In some ways, the story isn't simply about John Bolton. It's about the countless John Boltons who currently staff the federal bureaucracy. Deeply mediocre lifers, drunk on hubris, protected by bulletproof job security." And that's a good point, because you think about the National Security Council staff. These staffers, they can go, it fluctuates. There's no set number of staffers. They've had up to 400, hundreds of people. They've had as low as, I think, they're trying to cap it at 50, or at least they were in the last reform. But when you have 400 people working under a national security advisor, you basically have the president's own sort of CIA. But when you have those people working at cross purposes to the president, as I think we've certainly seen in this administration, you've got an amazing amount of space for freelancing, for shenanigans, for all kinds of nefarious things going on without the president. He can't keep track of all these people without the president even knowing.
Yeah, and then you have the benefits given to some of the intelligence agencies who can watch and see everything that's going on. So that is only going to lead to more chaos.
Yeah, that's true. And well, we wanted to cover another topic briefly here, and we kind of do a double header, I guess. But this is September 11th, 2019, and it marks 18 years since a group of mostly Saudis flew some planes into some buildings and helped us launch our war on terror, which has gone on with stops and starts ever since.
Well, I think most people alive at that time would remember 9/11 very clearly, as you and I do. But I think from the very beginning, we were off on a tangent on that, because when there is a killing, a simple murder or a mass murder, inevitably on TV, all you hear is, who has the motive to do this?
Yeah.
Who did this? What group of people did it, and what inclined them to do it? But they never asked the motive of what was going on here.
Yeah.
They assumed that they knew exactly the individuals that were doing it, but the motive was all mainly because they didn't like us, because we were free and we were rich, and therefore they didn't like us for this reason, and that just isn't true. That isn't true. I of course made the point that they had a motive that was more logical, and that is there was a lot of resentment. But the whole conclusion of it still is up in arms. We had a commission to study this, to find out who was complicit, how did it happen, who in government could be responsible, and yet, excuse me. So we were. The commission was done, but it lived up to my complaint about commissions.
Yeah.
They're there to cover up government mistakes or government's deliberate action, and I don't think it's the place to find truth. So I never place much, confidence in a government commission, and I think this could apply to the 9/11 Commission.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. This whole they hit us because we're so good and wonderful. It kind of launched this idea of American exceptionalism, which I think is kind of a false religion of self-worship, which is pretty unhealthy. And Jim Bovard put something up on Facebook today. He's a good friend of ours and one of the greatest spokesman for liberty, I think, that's out there. He made a good point. The war on terror, which 9/11 launched, quickly became the greatest political sham of our lifetimes. And that's a good line. He pointed out that Bush exploited 9/11 to attack Iraq, which had nothing to do with 9/11. He's used a justification to decimate our civil liberties, still decimating them today. Obama provided massive aid, military aid, to al-Qaeda-like groups in Libya and Syria, calling it the war on terror. Trump continues Obama's idiotic Syria policy and ends up at the end of the day, we're the ones treated like terrorists every time we try to buy an airplane ticket, get on an airplane, or do anything.
You know, and that makes my point that I was trying to make there, because they don't ask about motives. Then what do? Go and they expand the wars that cause the problem.
Yeah.
And the motives, I think, make all the difference in the world. And they decided, well, we have to get our enemies. Everybody knew there's enemies out there. Are they domestic or foreign? Well, they were foreign because that's why we had to go to Afghanistan and Iraq and all these places. But they decided the American people were the enemy, because that's who got punished.
Yeah,
and the Patriotic is still punishing us. And it still is even a reflection on the disaster of the CIA and the FBI and the Justice Department in this recent election. You know, in Mueller, I guess it is no surprise to you or anybody else, Mueller loved the Patriot Act.
Oh, yeah, he loved it.
And he made good use of it to think he could get away. And, fortunately, maybe the evidence will finally convict him, at least in the public, and that he is not the superior being he was when they appointed him.
Yeah.
So,
Saint Robert.
But I think it's the wrong interpretation. It wasn't had anything to do with our foreign policy. Therefore, we need more foreign adventurism and more invasion of our privacy and all the spying that goes on in the American people. So evidently, they said we have to get our enemies. It turned out we're part of that enemies, the average person in this country.
We're the enemies, yeah. Well, I'll close out with a reading assignment to our viewers. Go to the Ron Paul Institute website, ronpaulinstitute.org. Our lead article is written by Larry Johnson, who's a former CIA officer who really unpacks this fascinating story about an alleged CIA operative within Russia who was exfiltrated out. Larry Johnson really gives a backstory and explains that this was not the way the Washington Post and New York Times are portraying it as. It's really a good read. I read it several times this morning. While you're there, by the way, click on subscribe and get our updates, ronpaulinstitute.org. And I think you'll enjoy the article. Dr. Paul?
Very good. And I think whether we're talking about the tragedy on 9/11 and the consequences that followed, or whether we're talking about the National Security Council and having advisors and how bureaucratic that is, and that's a continuation of foreign policy. I think they all come together because probably 95% of the American people have gone to public education, listened to television that preaches this, and Republican and Democratic leaders are controlled by the deep state and the financial interests in military-industrial complex. Say I have but one policy, and that is intervention. And so if you look at the big picture, say, well, that's too big a picture. No, it's very simple. You only have to think about one thing: non-interventionists. Mind our own business. Mind our own business when it comes to dealing with other countries, and let the people decide how to spend the money and how they can make the money, and also protect civil liberties, not undermining civil liberties. That's what you'd have to do if we decide we want to, make a stab at it again and live in a free society. So it is a real challenge, but believe me, the direction we're going now hasn't been good, but I still believe strongly that there are a lot of people out there that agree with this, but I think we have to go through the climactic end of this, the climactic end of our empire, and the climactic end of our excessive spending and our empire, our spending, and the financial system, the Federal Reserve, and then those individuals who have come along and have recognized that there is an alternative, which happens to be, pretty much in line with some of the good parts of the American tradition. What we have today is not the American tradition. So I would think that, yes, it's bad for us. I don't think that all of a sudden firing Bolton, good move, but I don't think that's going to solve our problems. We have to change attitudes because, quite frankly, if I had to write a paper right now and give a political and psychological analysis of why Donald Trump does certain things in his foreign policy, I think I'd flunk the course because I have no idea some days what he's up to. And there are some days I'm up, very positive on this, and other days not. But I think it's a real challenge, but could be worse. And compared to what? That's the big thing. And right now, compared to John Bolton being there and having so much power, I would say today is a better day than yesterday. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. Please come back soon.